The morning was bright and the airport was buzzing with activity. People hurried in every direction, dragging suitcases, checking phones, calling for rides, and speaking in low, anxious tones about missing flights. Some were tired, some were excited, and some were just trying to get through the crowd without bumping into anyone. Among them, a woman walked calmly, carrying herself with quiet confidence. Her steps were steady, her posture straight, and there was a calm authority about her that made people unconsciously step aside as she passed. She wasn't someone who sought attention, but somehow her presence demanded it. She moved through security without any trouble. The TSA agents barely glanced at her, though she smiled politely as she passed. Her ID and boarding pass were ready in her hand. She had flown many times before, but today was different. Today she had an important meeting at the city hall after landing. But she didn't rush. She knew rushing made mistakes more likely, and mistakes were not something she tolerated in her life. She scanned the terminal, observing the people around her, noting the small details that many others ignored. She noticed a man struggling with his luggage, a mother trying to calm a crying child, and a group of teenagers laughing loudly as they walked past. Each little observation told her a story about the world in that moment. It was something she had always done, even in her personal life. She had a way of seeing the bigger picture, while also noticing the small details, and it served her well in her work. People often underestimated her because of her calm demeanor. They assumed calm meant weak, polite meant submissive, and quiet meant unimportant. They could not have been more wrong. When she reached the gate, she saw a long line of passengers waiting to board. The flight attendants were moving quickly, trying to keep everyone in order. There was tension in the air. Flights were running behind schedule. People were anxious, and the usual hum of the airport felt louder today. She joined the line without complaint, knowing patience was the best way to start any journey. People around her were muttering complaints about the delay, grumbling about the airline, and rolling their eyes at the staff. She noticed it all but stayed quiet, letting others vent while keeping her focus on what mattered. Finally, the boarding call came. The airline staff announced the flight number, the destination, and the priority boarding instructions. She followed the instructions calmly, showing her boarding pass when asked and stepping onto the jet bridge with ease. Once inside, she looked around the cabin. It was crowded, as most flights were, but she quickly found her seat near the middle of the plane. The seatbelt clicked into place and she took a deep breath, settling in. The people around her were a mix of personalities. Some were tired business travelers, tapping on laptops and scrolling on phones. Some were families, talking quietly or keeping children entertained. A few were older passengers moving slowly down the aisle with walkers or canes. She observed all of them silently. She noticed the pilot preparing in the cockpit, the flight attendants checking their supplies, and the tension in the cabin that seemed to grow with every passing minute. Airports had always been a place where she felt alert, ready, and aware of potential problems. Today was no exception. The flight attendants came down the aisle offering drinks and asking passengers if they needed anything. She smiled politely when offered water, refusing for now because she wanted to focus. She always prepared herself mentally before a flight, even a short one. It was part of how she maintained control over her day. Around her, the atmosphere was slightly tense. A few passengers were already complaining about their seats, the space, or the noise. The flight attendants moved quickly, but it was clear that some people's complaints were starting to fray the nerves of the staff. Then, she noticed the pilot from the corner of her eye. He was visible through the small window into the cockpit. He looked stressed. His shoulders were tight, his face was tense, and he kept glancing at his watch. She could tell he was trying to manage his stress, but it was not working well. She had seen that look before in people in positions of power who were under pressure. It was a dangerous look, one that could quickly turn into frustration directed at the wrong person. She made a mental note to be extra careful. There was no reason to be involved in someone else's bad mood, especially when she had an important day ahead. As the plane pushed back from the gate and taxied toward the runway, she remained calm. The engines roared to life. Passengers adjusted in their seats, and the hum of the aircraft filled the cabin. She took in a deep breath, letting it calm her mind. She thought about her responsibilities, about the meeting waiting for her, and about the hundreds of decisions she made every day. Patience and control were tools she had mastered, and she relied on them in situations like this. Around her, the tension in the cabin began to grow. A few passengers were clearly annoyed by the turbulence or the delay. Voices rose slightly, murmurs became complaints, and the energy in the room shifted. Some people started looking at their phones, scrolling through social media, trying to distract themselves from the discomfort. Others stared out the window, watching the runway move past. She stayed focused, observing without judgment, knowing that her calmness could influence those around her without her needing to say a word. She noticed a man in the row ahead tapping his foot nervously. She saw a mother in the middle of the cabin trying to quiet her child who had started to cry. And then she noticed the pilot again, checking instruments and talking briefly to the co-pilot. His frustration was becoming more noticeable, small gestures of irritation showing through his body language. She remained aware, knowing that people under pressure could act unpredictably. As the plane took off, the cabin lifted into the sky, and the tension eased slightly. Passengers adjusted, seatbelts clicked, and flight attendants moved quickly to serve drinks and snacks. She remained seated, hands resting calmly on her lap, eyes scanning subtly, still aware of the environment. She thought about how often people made assumptions based on appearances, assuming that those who looked calm were weak, or those who didn't speak loudly were unimportant. She had experienced it countless times, and it always surprised her how quickly people judged before knowing the facts. Even as the flight stabilized, she continued to watch. She noticed the pilot adjusting settings, talking to co-pilot in short, clipped sentences and glancing at the cabin with a tense look. Something about his demeanor told her he was on edge, and she made a mental note to remain cautious. She had learned over the years that recognizing tension early could prevent a lot of problems. Small details unnoticed by others often revealed the truth about a situation before it became obvious to everyone. Then, she noticed a passenger a few rows ahead looking back at her, whispering to someone beside them. She caught a few words, something about, "She looks like she could handle herself." It made her smile slightly inside. She wasn't there to impress anyone, and yet, people naturally sensed that she was someone who should not be underestimated. She thought about how often people misjudged situations based on appearances, and she felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that today, she would not be underestimated. The flight continued smoothly for now. She focused on her breathing, staying relaxed while alert. She knew that in a crowded, tense space like an airplane, a single moment could change everything. A small misunderstanding, a harsh word, or a sudden movement could turn a calm environment into chaos. She kept her body language neutral, her expression calm and her mind sharp. She was ready for anything, but she hoped that the day would pass without incident. Despite the calm she projected, she remained aware of the energy in the cabin. She noticed when passengers shifted in their seats, when the flight attendants exchanged brief, tense glances, and when the pilot's tone of voice changed slightly over the intercom. Every detail mattered. It was not paranoia, it was preparation. She had spent years learning to read people, to see through their masks and to anticipate actions before they happened. It was a skill that served her well both on the job and in everyday life. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, she finally allowed herself a small sigh of relief. The worst of the initial tension was over, and the flight appeared to be proceeding without incident. She leaned back slightly, hands folded calmly in her lap, and continued to observe quietly. She thought about the people around her, the world beyond the cabin, and the day waiting for her after landing. Even in this controlled environment, she knew life could change in an instant. Little did she know that moment of calm would not last for long. A small misunderstanding, combined with someone else's impatience and frustration, was about to set off a chain of events that would surprise everyone on the plane. She had prepared for many things in her life, but she could not have predicted the way the morning would unfold. And as she sat there quietly observing, the energy in the cabin was shifting in ways that would soon demand all of her patience, skill, and authority. The flight had been calm for a little while, but that calm was beginning to fray at the edges. The woman remained seated, composed, observing quietly as the passengers adjusted to the hum of the plane and the occasional bumps of turbulence. People around her were shifting in their seats, murmuring softly, some reading, some scrolling through their phones, and some simply staring out the windows at the clouds passing below. Everything seemed normal, almost routine. Yet she could feel the tension building. She had learned long ago that moments of calm often preceded events that could spiral quickly, and she stayed alert, ready to act if necessary. It started with a small misunderstanding. A flight attendant came by her row, offering a drink and a snack. She politely declined, but she asked a question about an earlier announcement regarding seat adjustments and overhead luggage space. The question was polite, measured, but direct. She wanted clarity, nothing more. It was something many passengers would never think twice about, yet she valued details, and clarity prevented problems later. The flight attendant nodded, but the pilot, who was visible through the small window into the cockpit, overheard only a fragment of the conversation. His stress had been building steadily since boarding, and every little sound seemed amplified. When he heard the woman's question, he misinterpreted her tone entirely. In his mind, he imagined it as impatience, maybe even a challenge to his authority. A single word or phrase taken out of context was enough to trigger his frustration, and he clenched his jaw, muttering under his breath about people being too demanding. By the time the flight attendant returned to the cockpit, the pilot was already stewing. He had always been proud of his ability to manage a plane under pressure, but he also had little tolerance for what he perceived as insubordination or challenge. Today, his stress had reached a tipping point. The combination of a delayed flight, impatient passengers, and the constant pressure of schedules had frayed his nerves. He was no longer just cautious or alert. He was reactive, ready to assert control in a way that would make him feel powerful in a moment of vulnerability. As the woman leaned back in her seat, still calm, she noticed subtle changes in the cabin energy. The flight attendants were moving a little faster, their movements sharper. Some passengers were exchanging quick, curious glances. Something was about to happen, and she could feel it. She had spent years reading situations like this. Small, micro-expressions, subtle shifts in posture, a tightening jaw or clenched hands. They all told a story that most people missed, and she was paying attention. The pilot opened the cockpit door briefly, stepping into the aisle. His eyes scanned the cabin with a controlled intensity, but when they settled on the woman, something shifted. He thought he saw defiance in her calm gaze, even though she was doing nothing but sitting quietly. His mind, clouded by stress and impatience, decided in an instant that she needed to be put in her place. He wanted to assert dominance quickly, to remind himself and everyone else that he was in control. Without any warning, he approached her seat, his face tight with frustration. The woman looked up at him, her expression polite but neutral, expecting that he would respond professionally. She did not raise her voice. She did not gesture aggressively. She merely prepared herself for what might come next. She had dealt with difficult people many times in her life, but this situation was unusual. The stakes were higher because this was an enclosed space with dozens of witnesses, any of whom could misinterpret the moment. Then it happened. The pilot, in a flash of poor judgment, raised his hand and slapped her. It was a shocking, impulsive action, done without thought or consideration. The cabin went silent instantly. The sound of the slap seemed to echo through the small space, and passengers froze in disbelief. Some gasped softly, others sat stiffly, unsure whether to speak or stay quiet. The woman's hand had been resting calmly on her lap, and now it had been slapped, an aggressive act that violated her personal space. For a brief moment, there was disbelief in her eyes. She could hardly process what had just happened. The instinct to react strongly was there, a flash of anger, but she suppressed it immediately. Years of discipline and experience allowed her to control her initial reaction. She remained seated, composed, though every muscle in her body was alert. Her mind raced, analyzing the situation and planning her next step. She knew that this moment would define the rest of the flight, and she needed to handle it carefully. Passengers around them were whispering, their eyes wide with shock. Some looked at the pilot with disbelief, others at the woman, wondering why she hadn't reacted aggressively. A few pulled out their phones, quietly recording, knowing that something unusual was unfolding. The energy in the cabin had shifted completely. It was no longer just a flight. It had become a tense moment of confrontation, an unexpected drama in the sky. The woman took a slow, deep breath. Her voice was calm, steady, but filled with quiet authority when she spoke. "Sir," she said politely, "I need you to stop. That was completely inappropriate." Her words were measured, deliberate, and calm. They carried a weight that demanded attention, not just from him, but from everyone in the cabin. Her tone was not angry, but it was firm, and it made the pilot hesitate for the first time. He looked at her, confused. He had expected resistance, maybe shouting or aggression, but what he saw instead was calm, composed authority. He was caught off guard. His mind, which had been ready to assert control with force, struggled to process the reality of the situation. He had misjudged her entirely. For a moment he saw her as just another passenger, but now something about her demeanor suggested that she was not someone who would accept mistreatment silently. The woman's calmness seemed to draw the attention of everyone around them. Passengers were watching closely now, whispering softly, leaning slightly forward in their seats. Even the flight attendants paused, sensing that this was not an ordinary conflict. The pilot's frustration began to mix with confusion. He was unsure how to respond, and the silence in the cabin made it feel even heavier. Then the woman spoke again, her tone deliberate, commanding respect without raising her voice. "I want you to know that I am not just a passenger. I hold a position of authority in my city, and this kind of behavior is unacceptable. I expect a professional response immediately." Her words were calm but precise, and the weight behind them was unmistakable. The pilot's initial sense of power began to crumble. He had assumed control in a situation where he had none, and now he realized the seriousness of his actions. The passengers' reactions grew. Some murmured softly to each other, pointing discreetly toward the front of the plane. A few raised eyebrows, and a couple whispered about recording the event. The atmosphere in the cabin was tense, charged with anticipation. Everyone sensed that this was no ordinary dispute. The woman remained composed, her eyes steady, her body language controlled. She had learned over years of experience how to manage confrontations without escalating them, but she also knew when it was time to assert authority. The pilot's face was pale now, his frustration giving way to panic. He realized he had made a terrible mistake, and the reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. He had acted impulsively, without thinking, and now he faced the possibility of serious consequences. The weight of the moment pressed down on him as he struggled to find the right words. He wanted to apologize, to explain, but his pride and confusion tangled together, making it hard to speak. The woman remained calm, giving him space to process his actions. She had no intention of letting the situation escalate further, but she also would not allow herself to be treated with disrespect. Her experience in leadership had taught her that people often test limits, but limits must be clearly and firmly established. She spoke again, gently but firmly. "This is not about personal feelings, it is about professionalism. What just happened cannot happen again." Her words were precise, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Passengers were now fully engaged. Some leaned slightly forward in their seats, trying to catch every word. A few quietly whispered among themselves, expressing shock and surprise. Everyone could see that this was more than a passenger disagreement. It was a confrontation with serious implications. The energy in the cabin was tense but controlled, a strange mix of fear, curiosity, and anticipation. The pilot took a small step back, his hands trembling slightly. He knew he had crossed a line. His actions had violated not only personal boundaries, but professional standards as well. For the first time in his career, he felt completely unprepared to handle a situation that involved someone whose authority surpassed his assumptions. The woman's calm confidence made him realize just how unprepared he had been. She stayed seated, composed, her eyes steady on him. Her presence alone demanded accountability. She did not shout, she did not wave her hands, and she did not react emotionally. Instead, she allowed the weight of her authority and her composure to communicate what words could not. She had learned long ago that power was not about volume or aggression. It was about presence, clarity, and calm certainty. The pilot struggled internally, his mind racing. He wanted to explain, to defend himself, but he knew any attempt at justification would sound weak or defensive. He had acted impulsively, and now he faced the reality of his mistake. The woman's calm authority contrasted sharply with his agitation, highlighting the severity of his error. The passengers watched silently, sensing the shift in power, the sudden realization that assumptions could be dangerously wrong. In that moment, the pilot's pride began to crumble. He had misjudged her entirely, and the consequences of that misjudgment were becoming clear. The woman remained composed, her expression calm but firm. She was fully aware of the tension, fully aware of the eyes on them, but she did not waver. She knew that maintaining control of herself would ensure that the situation did not escalate further, while also sending a clear message about accountability. The cabin was silent now, everyone watching closely. The energy had shifted completely. What had begun as a routine flight was now a tense moment of confrontation, a small drama unfolding in the air. The woman's calm and authority contrasted sharply with the pilot's impulsive aggression, creating a tension that could not be ignored. Passengers exchanged glances, whispering softly, some recording discreetly. Everyone could sense that this was not just a personal conflict. It was a moment that carried real consequences. The silence in the cabin was heavy, almost suffocating. Every passenger seemed to be holding their breath, unsure of what would happen next. The woman remained seated, calm and composed, but her mind was racing. She had dealt with difficult people countless times before, but being on a plane made things more complicated. The confined space, the passengers watching, the pilot's impulsive actions, all of it created a tension that was almost tangible. She knew that the next few moments would define how this situation unfolded, and she needed to act wisely. The pilot's hands trembled slightly as he looked at her. He had expected resistance, maybe shouting or anger. But what he saw instead was calm authority, the kind that demanded respect without demanding it verbally. His mind was struggling to process the fact that he had misjudged her completely. He had acted in anger, letting stress and pride dictate his actions, and now he was beginning to realize how badly he had miscalculated. The reality of the situation was slowly sinking in. The woman decided it was time to make her identity known. She did not raise her voice, she did not gesture aggressively, and she did not accuse him. Instead, she spoke clearly, deliberately, and firmly. "Sir," she began, her voice calm but carrying a weight that made people stop whatever they were doing. "You need to understand that this behavior is not acceptable. I am in a position of authority in my city, and what just happened is completely inappropriate." The pilot blinked, confused. He had heard the words, but he had no idea what she meant. He had expected complaints, perhaps a passenger getting upset, but this sounded serious in a way he was not prepared for. "What are you talking about?" he asked, trying to maintain some sense of control, though the quiver in his voice betrayed him. She leaned forward slightly, just enough to convey seriousness, but without being threatening. "I am the chief of police in my city," she said, her words measured and precise. "You have just assaulted me, and you need to understand the consequences of your actions." The pilot's face went pale. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out immediately. For a moment he thought she was exaggerating, trying to intimidate him. It didn't make sense. How could a passenger have such authority? He had never experienced anything like this before, and he had flown hundreds of flights. His assumptions about her, based on her calm demeanor and quiet presence, were completely wrong. Around the cabin, passengers began to notice the tension rising. Some leaned forward, whispering to each other, trying to catch every word. A few passengers discreetly started recording on their phones, sensing that this was a moment unlike any other. The air in the plane was thick with anticipation. Everyone could feel that something important was happening, though no one yet knew the full story. The woman's voice remained steady, controlled, and firm. "I have documentation to prove my position," she continued. "I am asking you to stop immediately and to conduct yourself professionally. What you just did is a serious violation of boundaries and law. I am giving you a chance to correct your actions now before this escalates further." The pilot swallowed hard, his hands still slightly shaking. He glanced toward the flight attendants, who were observing quietly from a short distance. Their expressions showed concern, but they knew it was not their place to intervene directly. They had seen passengers complain before, but nothing like this. The situation was delicate. The pilot was now realizing that he had no idea how to handle a person of authority in a confined space like this, and panic began to rise inside him. He tried to speak, to explain himself, but his words came out in a jumbled mess. "I didn't know. I mean, his voice faltered, his sentences broken and ineffective. The woman's calm gaze never left him, and every word she spoke carried the weight of authority. Passengers watched silently, sensing the shift in power. The pilot, who had thought he was in control moments ago, now understood that the tables had turned completely. "Listen carefully," she said, her tone unwavering. "This is not personal. This is about professionalism, responsibility, and respect. You need to acknowledge your mistake, and you need to follow the proper procedure to make amends. If this incident is not handled correctly, there will be legal consequences and your career may be at risk. Do you understand?" The pilot nodded shakily, too stunned to respond verbally. His mind was racing, trying to figure out how to recover, but every option he considered seemed inadequate. The realization that he had misjudged her entirely was sinking in fully now. He had assumed that her calm presence meant weakness, that her quiet demeanor meant she would not assert herself. He had been completely wrong, and the truth was undeniable. Passengers around them were now fully engaged. Some whispered quietly to each other, exchanging shocked glances. Others leaned back in their seats, still recording. The energy in the cabin had shifted completely. What had started as a routine flight was now a dramatic moment of confrontation and revelation. The woman's calm authority contrasted sharply with the pilot's impulsive aggression, creating a tension that everyone could feel. The woman remained composed, giving the pilot a chance to process the information and respond appropriately. She did not raise her voice or use aggression. She simply held her ground, confident in her position and in her ability to manage the situation. Her presence alone was commanding, and passengers could sense that she was someone who would not be underestimated. The pilot's hands clenched slightly at his sides. He wanted to apologize, to explain himself, but he struggled to find the words. The enormity of the situation was beginning to overwhelm him. He had acted without thinking, letting stress and pride guide his actions, and now he faced the consequences. Every instinct in his body told him that he had crossed a line, and every passenger on the plane was witnessing the fallout. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and hesitant. I didn't realize who you were. I acted impulsively. I apologize." His words were fragmented and his apology lacked confidence, but it was a start. The woman's eyes remained steady on him, reading his body language, assessing the sincerity of his words. "Your apology is noted," she said calmly, her voice measured. "But this is not just about words. This is about accountability. You need to ensure that proper actions are taken to address what happened. I will be documenting this incident, and I expect the airline to follow the proper procedures. Understand that actions like this have consequences regardless of intent." The pilot's face paled further. He had imagined that any mistake could be smoothed over with a few words, but he now realized that the situation was far more serious. He had crossed a line that could affect his career, his reputation, and potentially his freedom. The woman's calm authority made it clear that there would be no leniency for impulsive, aggressive actions. Passengers continued to watch quietly, their attention fully captured. Some whispered among themselves, expressing disbelief that a routine flight could turn into such a dramatic situation. Others noted the irony of the moment. A pilot, someone responsible for safety and control, had allowed frustration to dictate his actions and had misjudged a passenger completely. The woman's composed demeanor, her authority, and her ability to handle the situation were commanding respect from everyone in the cabin. The pilot tried to regain some control, speaking again in a shaky voice. I understand. I will follow the procedures. I didn't mean to. His words faltered, and the woman held her gaze steady, letting him realize that words alone were not enough. Accountability required action, and she was prepared to ensure that it was taken. "Actions speak louder than words," she said calmly, her voice carrying a quiet authority that demanded attention. "I will be reporting this incident, and I expect the airline to follow through. You will need to cooperate fully, and I expect no further incidents of this nature." Her tone was firm but not aggressive, and it carried a weight that made even the pilot's most stubborn instincts falter. Around the cabin, the energy remained tense. Passengers were whispering quietly, exchanging glances, and some continued to record the unfolding situation. Everyone could sense that this was more than a personal disagreement. It was a moment that highlighted the importance of respect, authority, and accountability. The woman had turned what could have been a chaotic incident into a controlled confrontation, and the contrast between her calm authority and the pilot's impulsive actions was striking. The pilot's shoulders slumped slightly. He had expected a confrontation, but he had not anticipated the level of authority and control the woman displayed. He realized fully now that he had misjudged her entirely. She was not someone who could be intimidated or dismissed, and the realization hit him with full force. The weight of his mistake pressed heavily on him, and he struggled to find a way to recover from it. The woman remained calm, observing him carefully. She had seen similar reactions before in her career, people who acted impulsively under stress only to realize too late that their assumptions were completely wrong. She knew that maintaining her composure would ensure the situation did not escalate further, while also making it clear that accountability was essential. Her presence alone conveyed authority, respect, and the seriousness of the moment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity to both of them, the pilot nodded slightly. His face showed a mix of shame, fear, and disbelief. He understood now that the situation required more than words, that his actions had real consequences, and that he had misjudged her entirely. The cabin remained quiet, every passenger watching, sensing the gravity of the moment. The woman leaned back slightly in her seat, maintaining her calm demeanor. She had asserted her authority, made her position clear, and ensured that the pilot understood the seriousness of his actions. The confrontation was far from over, but she had established the boundary clearly. Passengers could see that she was composed, confident, and capable of handling the situation, and many felt a quiet admiration for her poise under pressure. The moment in the cabin hung in the air, heavy with tension. The pilot's face was pale, his hands fidgeting near the controls as he tried to regain composure. He had expected that a quick, impulsive reaction would assert his control over the situation, but now he realized he had no control at all. The woman, calm and poised, had turned the entire dynamic upside down. Every passenger could feel it. Everyone sensed that he had misjudged her completely, and the shift in power was unmistakable. The woman sat quietly, her hands resting on her lap, eyes focused on him without anger, but with firm authority. She did not raise her voice or act aggressively. That was the point. She let the weight of her presence speak louder than words ever could. Years of leadership experience had taught her that composure was far more effective than confrontation. People often underestimated her because she didn't demand attention with loud words or dramatic gestures. They assumed calm meant weakness, but it didn't. It meant control. And today, that control was absolute. Passengers around them were whispering quietly, exchanging glances, some craning their necks to see what was happening. Phones subtly recorded the moment, capturing the tension in the cabin. It was unusual for something so personal to play out in such a public space, and yet, the woman's quiet authority made it compelling. People could feel the difference between someone reacting out of fear or anger and someone acting from a place of true confidence and awareness. The pilot cleared his throat, voice low, trembling slightly. I didn't know who you were. I acted without thinking," he stammered. I'm sorry." His apology was hesitant, fractured, but it was sincere in the only way he knew how. It came from a place of panic and realization. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that he had allowed his pride and stress to cloud his judgment completely. The woman's eyes softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. "I accept that your actions were impulsive, but an apology is only the beginning," she said. "Accountability is more than words. There will be consequences for what happened, and you need to understand the seriousness of your actions. This is not personal. It is about responsibility, professionalism, and respect." The weight of her words settled on him like a cold wave. The moment he had thought would affirm his control had instead shown him how easily he could misread a situation and the people in it. He glanced around at the passengers, many of whom were staring silently, some whispering softly among themselves. The realization that dozens of witnesses were present made his regret even sharper. There was no hiding, no pretending it didn't happen. The actions were recorded, remembered, and already influencing everyone's perception of him. The woman leaned back slightly, still composed, still calm. Her posture was relaxed, but it carried strength. She didn't need to make a scene. She didn't need to escalate the confrontation. Her control over herself and over the situation was enough to make the pilot and everyone else in the cabin understand the gravity of what had just occurred. This was leadership in its purest form. quiet, unwavering, and commanding respect without fear or intimidation. The pilot swallowed hard, struggling to find words. I understand. I'll do whatever is required. I didn't mean to. I didn't think, His voice faltered again, the apology in complete fumbling. He wanted to explain, to justify, to make it seem like a mistake anyone could have made. But he knew deep down that it wasn't just a simple mistake. It was a lapse in judgment that had consequences, and he had underestimated her completely. She listened patiently, letting him fumble. Acknowledging your mistake is necessary, she said. But acknowledgement is only part of the process. Actions must follow words. You will be expected to cooperate fully with the airline and with the proper authorities once we land. This incident will be documented, and appropriate steps will be taken. Understand that intent does not erase impact. You need to be prepared for that. Around them, passengers were whispering, but now the tone was one of admiration. People noticed her composure, her ability to maintain control in an extremely tense moment. Some exchanged glances that said quietly, "She handled that perfectly." Others subtly recorded, understanding the weight of what was unfolding. The air was thick with realization. Here was someone who could command respect without raising her voice. Someone whose authority was unmistakable. Someone who demanded accountability in a way that few others could. The pilot's face was pale, sweat forming at his hairline. The realization that he had acted impulsively, and that his actions could cost him his career, hit him fully. His body language showed defeat. He was slumping slightly in the cockpit, shaking his head, trying to process how he had let a single moment of frustration dictate his behavior. He had underestimated her entirely, and now he was paying the price. She remained calm, giving him time to process the situation. She knew that people often acted defensively when confronted, and that patience was essential. If she had reacted aggressively, the situation could have escalated into conflict, panic, or chaos. By staying composed, she maintained control of the environment, allowing reason and authority to guide the interaction. Her presence alone communicated that she would not tolerate disrespect, and that she expected proper behavior moving forward. The pilot swallowed again, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. I understand. I'll cooperate. I really am sorry." His words were simple, but they carried genuine regret. It was not just fear speaking. It was the dawning realization that he had misread her entirely and had acted in a way that was completely unacceptable. The woman nodded slightly. "That is a start," she said. "But remember, words without action mean nothing. This incident will be documented, and you must follow the necessary procedures. There will be consequences, and they will be enforced. This is about responsibility, not emotion." Her tone was calm, steady, and unwavering, and the pilot understood fully that she was not bluffing. Passengers continued to watch quietly, their attention fully captured. Some whispered softly among themselves, amazed at how she maintained control in a situation that could have easily spiraled out of control. Others exchanged glances that reflected admiration, noting the stark contrast between the pilot's impulsive actions and her composed, deliberate response. The cabin had shifted in energy. What had begun as a tense confrontation had now turned into a lesson in authority, composure, and accountability. The pilot's hands shook slightly as he reached for his controls. He knew he had to maintain professionalism now, but every movement reminded him of the impulsive action he had just taken. The woman remained calm, not flinching or reacting to the subtle tension in his body. She had learned long ago that control was about presence, not confrontation, and she used that skill now to maintain stability in the cabin. A few passengers exchanged quiet murmurs. "I can't believe she stayed so calm," one whispered. "Most people would have yelled." Another said, "Yeah, but she handled it perfectly. Look at how the pilot looks. He knows he messed up." The whispers traveled quietly through the cabin, reinforcing the gravity of the moment. Everyone was witnessing something rare, composure under extreme pressure. The woman looked at the pilot again, her eyes steady. "I will be reporting this incident," she said. "I expect full cooperation with the airline and with the proper authorities once we land. Understand that any attempt to minimize this event will not work. Actions have consequences, and this is a serious matter." Her words were precise, leaving no room for ambiguity. The pilot understood fully. There would be no shortcuts, no quick resolution. He had acted impulsively, and now he would have to face the outcome. He nodded, swallowing hard. I understand. I'll cooperate fully. I'm truly sorry. The repetition reflected his growing anxiety, but also his recognition of the seriousness of the situation. This was no longer a fleeting moment of embarrassment. It was a lesson in accountability, one he would not soon forget. The woman remained seated, composed and calm. She had asserted authority without aggression, made her expectations clear, and ensured that he understood the gravity of his actions. The cabin was quiet, filled with passengers observing, some recording, some whispering, and all sensing the weight of what had happened. The energy in the room was still tense but under her control. For the pilot, the realization hit fully. He had acted impulsively, misjudged a passenger entirely, and now faced immediate consequences. His professional pride, which had driven him to react without thinking, had crumbled. He felt regret, shame, and fear all at once. The woman's composed authority had turned the tables completely, and he understood that recovery would be difficult. Every passenger had witnessed his mistake, and there was no undoing it. The woman's calm presence continued to dominate the space. She did not need to raise her voice or act aggressively. Her authority was clear, her expectations defined, and her control over the situation unshakable. Passengers watched quietly, sensing the contrast between her composure and the pilot's panic. Some whispered, others nodded slightly, recognizing that she had handled a potentially volatile situation with skill and grace. The flight continued, but the tension lingered. The pilot kept his eyes forward, hands steady now but mind racing. He knew the consequences of his impulsive action would follow him beyond this flight. The woman remained seated, calm, composed, and unshaken, a quiet reminder that authority and respect were earned through presence, skill, and integrity, not by raising a hand or acting impulsively. The plane began its descent, and the energy in the cabin shifted again, though tension still lingered. Passengers were quiet, their eyes flicking between the woman and the pilot. Everyone sensed that the flight had changed from a simple journey into an unforgettable event. The woman remained composed, hands folded in her lap, exuding calm authority. Her presence alone reassured some passengers while reminding others that respect and professionalism were not optional. The pilot, in contrast, seemed completely drained. His face was pale, his shoulders slumped, and there was a stiffness in his movements that betrayed the weight of his regret. He had spent the entire flight replaying the moment in his mind, seeing his mistake from every angle. He realized fully now how reckless he had been, how quickly a brief lapse of judgment could spiral into a situation with far-reaching consequences. He was no longer in control, and that realization was a shock he would not forget. As the plane touched down and taxied toward the gate, the atmosphere remained heavy but contained. Passengers whispered quietly among themselves, sharing their reactions. Some were still in shock, some in awe, and some simply relieved that the flight was almost over. It was clear that everyone on the plane had witnessed a moment that would stick in their minds for a long time. The woman remained seated, calm and focused, her eyes scanning the cabin occasionally to ensure that the situation remained under control. The flight attendants moved quickly, assisting passengers as they prepared to disembark, but their eyes occasionally flicked toward the pilot and the woman. Everyone knew that what had occurred required careful handling. The pilot had been reckless, and though he was still the one responsible for flying the plane safely, the responsibility now extended beyond navigation. There was accountability to consider, legal implications, and a very public incident to manage. The plane came to a stop at the gate, and the announcement to disembark echoed through the cabin. Passengers slowly began to gather their belongings, but many remained seated, waiting for a moment to fully process what had happened. The woman stood, her posture straight, calm but resolute. She didn't rush or act impatiently. She moved with the same quiet authority she had maintained throughout the flight, her composure unwavering. As she passed the pilot, she spoke again, softly but firmly. "This is not over. Full accountability will be required. I expect cooperation with all procedures, and I expect this incident to be documented appropriately." Her words were precise, carrying weight without anger. The pilot nodded silently, unable to meet her gaze fully. The depth of his regret was visible in every movement and every subtle tremor in his hands. Passengers moved past them, some offering quiet nods of respect to the woman. They had witnessed her handle a highly stressful, potentially dangerous situation with calm authority. Many were impressed not just by her position, but by the way she managed herself in the circumstances. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, only composure and control, which had turned what could have been chaos into a powerful demonstration of leadership. Once the cabin emptied enough to allow private discussion, airline staff approached the woman. They had already been aware of the incident, and now needed to confirm the details for proper documentation. She cooperated fully, explaining exactly what had happened, giving a calm and precise account. She did not exaggerate or embellish. She reported the facts clearly and professionally. Her approach left no room for ambiguity, making it obvious that the pilot's impulsive action had serious consequences. The pilot remained seated in the cockpit, head in his hands. Airline staff gently requested that he step out and provide his account of the incident. He obeyed quietly, his pride and composure shattered. Every movement reminded him of the mistake he had made, and the fact that he could not undo it. He had acted impulsively, misjudged a passenger entirely, and now faced both professional and public scrutiny. It was a moment of reckoning, and he understood fully that he had no choice but to accept the consequences. Authorities were contacted to ensure that proper procedures were followed. The woman provided her identification and documentation as the chief of police. She maintained her calm, professional demeanor, cooperating fully while making clear that the pilot's actions could not go unaddressed. Airline officials and legal authorities treated her with respect, recognizing her authority and the seriousness of the situation. The pilot, meanwhile, had no defense that could minimize the severity of his impulsive act. Passengers slowly left the airport, many still talking quietly about what had occurred. Some posted on social media, sharing the story with a sense of awe and disbelief. The incident quickly spread online, sparking conversations about assumptions, respect, and the dangers of acting impulsively. People marveled at the woman's composure and professionalism, noting that her authority had not relied on anger or intimidation, but on calm confidence and clear communication. Meanwhile, the pilot faced immediate professional consequences. Airline officials placed him on temporary suspension, pending a formal review of his actions. Investigations were launched both internally and with oversight authorities. The reality of what had happened weighed heavily on him. He had acted on stress and pride, misjudging someone entirely, and the consequences would follow him long after this day. It was a lesson he would not forget. The woman, despite the stressful circumstances, remained composed throughout. She had turned what could have been a humiliating, chaotic situation into an example of professionalism and authority. Her calm presence had prevented escalation, protected passengers from panic, and ensured that proper accountability was established. People who witnessed her actions were inspired by her ability to maintain composure under pressure, showing that true authority is not about force but about control, clarity, and responsibility. In the days that followed, the story spread widely. News outlets covered the incident, focusing on how a seemingly ordinary flight became a moment of unexpected confrontation and remarkable leadership. Many articles praised the woman for her composure and professionalism, highlighting how she had turned a potent,